Yep.
Um, I'm not all that good at math, and so I finished your book without knowing how old your daughter is now.
My daughter is now 14.
Okay, because she was 13, I think, when the book ended.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I should have kept track of, and it's a recent, like it came out in 2024. So how long ago were you writing Iron Dad?
Well, there were different phases to it. A major core of the book, where there's the blog aspect that talks about going through treatment,
Yeah,
obviously
I've got
was
all that.
11 years ago. But I was writing the book last year
Yeah,
primarily.
see, because
And
in reading the blog and in figuring out the time frame of this sort of, 10, 11 year journey, and you're 10 years um, out free of the cancer right now. So I sort of did all that, but then by the time it was done, I'd sort of lost track of like, okay, this is recounting the past. And I'm of
and
course
and it
always interested in the present tense.
For sure. Well, and the present tense changes every day, and that's
Of
been
course
one
it
of the
does.
amazing things of when I really started having the reflection of putting the book together. And I talked about my time when I was in Alaska.
Yeah.
That was a year and 3 months ago,
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
the experience in life has just been so evolutionary since then, for sure.
Well, some of it felt very recent, like right now. And the book's new and had that material. Your daughter's 13 now; she's 14. Which, by the way, she's the age of my one of my younger grandchildren. Jack is 14 as we speak. And today,
Hmm.
when we're done this, I really understood the aspect of your book of the love of your daughter and what that meant in the sense that, I have grown children, but I've been doing a lot of grandchild care in the last year. So just before I sat down here, I went and checked a roast chicken that I was cooking to take with me to pick my granddaughter up, who's 10, so I can take her to the beach afterward with a sort of a
Oh,
picnic dinner. So we're very
sure.
much on the same wavelength when it comes to prioritizing what we do in the big things, like, say, recovering from cancer, in view of what we're doing every day with these kids, which is the real motivation. So I like that about the
It
book. I
is.
like that through line. But anyway, hey, let me introduce you properly. I forgot this is a podcast, but let's stop pretending we're just talking and do this. This is In
That's
Conversation
cool.
with Frank Schaeffer, and today my guest is author Paul. Do you say Weigel or Weigel?
It's Weigel, but I go
Weigel.
with whatever people
I
say to me
figured it was
nowadays.
Weigel, but I was going to check. Paul Weigel is a father, a six-time Ironman triathlete, a college professor, a lover of the outdoors, and a self-described professional dabbler. Otherwise, the nice way to put that is a polymath. You don't have to call yourself a professional dabbler. I say polymath. You have a lot of things you do.
Remember
Paul
that.
is the author of Iron Dad, and I've got it right here. A I'm going to read the title again. Iron Dad, a cancer survivor story of discovering strength, life, and love through fatherhood. And let's see, one more piece of boilerplate here. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, it has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I thought what I would do is I've marked, just so you know, I actually read your book. See the dog ears?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
That's awesome. Thank
And
you.
I didn't do that randomly. I've got actual quotes to read you here. And I like doing this because a lot of times I get the book on Kindle. Actually, I just bought your book on Kindle this morning, and I decided to
Awesome.
go with the dog-eared thing here instead. Um,
I really like old school myself.
I do too.
I've certainly got copies of both, obviously, but I go
Yeah,
back and I've got a version of the book by my bedstand, and
yeah,
I will find myself reading through chapters again, saying, "Yeah, that
exactly.
seems about right." Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems a lot more real on paper. I don't like reading just on the screen. But I'm going to start with something from the beginning here, July 2023, right where you begin. 10 years, it's hard to believe it's been that long. 363,652 days, 87,648 hours. And then you have how many seconds it is. That's the amount of time I've officially been a cancer survivor. Natalie, my daughter, and I are riding the Great Alaskan Railroad halfway through our trip of a lifetime to the Danieli National Park and then Anchorage, Alaska. This is a trip as much to celebrate being 10 years cancer free as it is to celebrate finally being free and at peace with myself. And that is a good way to sum the book up because there's a couple stories here. One is about an illness, another is about achievement in the Ironman quest, having had a hip replacement as well. And the other, of course, is about your daughter and your love for her kind of motivating what I would call the entire journey. I don't know if I've got that right.
That is a great perspective of it, Frank, and thank you. You know, it was never intended to be what it has ended up being.
Right.
Um, I started the book, and as I started penning out in that section you read through, I was just trying to really start explaining what my life was about,
Yeah.
and to be able to look and say, it was so complex of yes, and fighting cancer, being a dad, trying to figure out what the rest of my life was going to look like to get to that point of reconciling. It was a
Yeah.
pretty amazing time.
Well, I like one thing I really like about the book that sort of jives with my life, although we've had very different lives and, I've never done the Ironman quest and so forth and so on. I grew up in the Swiss Alps, by the way, so we have a connection with mountains and hiking.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to say is that I like the fact that the book takes itself out of the context of just, a story about your personal journey and gets into the area of how this affected the people around you and how they affected you in terms of your daughter. And I thought that was really lifts the book up and makes it something. You go on at the here and you say, the only thing keeping me alive was my fear of how horrible it would be for others to try to understand why I was gone and the decisions I'd made. But just as much, this question haunted me. If I were gone, would anyone notice? You didn't mean to do that in that context necessarily, but in a way, and I'm not reading into this because I've read the book, um, but in a way, it's funny. I've just to go completely, uh, you know, off the chart here a minute. If I was talking to someone, because I talk to a lot of people, and if I was talking to someone, and to be honest, talking to myself about contemplating suicide at some point with a terminal
Yeah.
illness and or depression, I'm going to reread that line because I just think it ought to be lifted out of the book and put somewhere where people, are thinking of doing away with themselves. The only thing keeping me alive was my fear of how horrible it would be for others to try to understand why I was gone and the decision I had made. And I really think that that's cuts to the heart of so much more than just your story in terms of the way we see life. And I'm wondering, and I'm sorry to go so hot and heavy at the beginning, but if this had all gone south and you had found yourself in the situation where, the terminal diagnosis was in fact terminal, there's a lot of people in that situation that don't put it the way you just did. They sort of are thinking of themselves and not the effect they're having on the people around them. And I'm just wondering how you follow that train of thought through your story.
Boy, Frank, you went hot and heavy fast, didn't you there?
Yeah,
Um, there is a huge amount of truth to that. I mean, and we certainly have got lives that, I mean, we have this identity that we are supposed to be fighters and live every single moment to the fullest, and have that last breath until hopefully we're 80, 90, or whatever it may be. But
yeah,
sometimes life is, and for many of us, life can be just so hard and overwhelming all the time.
yeah,
And whether it was growing up that I just felt alone and in anguish,
yeah,
and that I really did wonder that if I would be hit by a truck or something were to have
yeah.
happened, would anybody notice? What legacy I have? And certainly then as I was going through treatment, and there were different times of, would I just be erased off the earth and not be a memory?
I mean, you say a little later in the beginning here, and I've got a lot of these quotes here, so bear with me. But we're talking about your book, so I'm a reader and a writer myself, so I like to read from it. Every conversation with my parents, I felt my thoughts and emotions were being analyzed, interpreted, projected. The information stored later for critique, an ongoing experiment conducted with emotional remove. And of course, you identify the fact that they were both psychologists.
Yeah,
And of course that's tough because my parents were both kind of theologians. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical background.
right.
Everything there was given a theological twist. In other words, we were sort of told that the way we behaved to other people would bring them to Jesus and they would be saved, or push them away and they would be lost. And it was on you. So there were no neutral conversations. You know, if my mother started
Right.
talking to someone on an airplane, it wasn't because she was a friendly woman. It's because at some point she would want to turn the conversation to the way of salvation and make it
Yes.
theological. I totally got that. The kind of growing realization that this isn't a conversation, this is something else. So I just want to
Yes.
talk about that and share the experience with you of my own life and say, does that relate to having psychologists who are cold and analyzing you and never quite the mom and dad that we think of as parents?
Oh my gosh, in so many different ways, and thanks for highlighting it that way. I mean, for me, that to it was never about taking information as a sincere, loving approach. It
Yeah,
always was, to your point, of because I'm going to take that information to do something with it,
yeah,
whether it be me or any other circumstance. And certainly with my mom, but both my parents, there always was a judgment factor going on.
yeah,
Certainly as a psychologist, my sister and I actually were recently talking about that, when my mom died a couple years ago, that she was very actively involved in her church, but the
yeah,
reason she was actively involved was she was the one behind the scenes saying, well, you know why they're doing this is
yeah,
because this and that and that and this. And so both of them always viewed themselves on a higher plane and higher resolve, which
yeah.
meant that I never could come to a point of achieving that for
Yeah,
sure.
I wonder if some of your life could be defined, not so much this book, but now we're just talking off the cuff here. You know, I look when you get a little older, I'm 72 now, and you're looking back, and I have grandchildren and so forth and so on. Um, you know, you see your life differently because you kind of see how it was affected by things that you didn't quite understand what was going on at the time. And I see
Right.
that very much in your book. And I'm wondering if your interest in the Ironman competition, your outdoor life, your hiking, this kind of physicality of your life, because you're a very physical person, has to do with a sort of rebellion in a good sense of the word against the kind of intellectualized view of life that is always analyzing the kind of the psychological thing. In the same
Yeah.
way as my being raised in an intensely theological background means that, you know, I sort of went away from that into the visual arts. I'm a painter, I've been a filmmaker, I'm a writer. In other words, it was not what my parents were doing. And I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but somehow I know your relationship with your daughter is a reaction to your relationship with your parents. In other words, you said, whatever this
Yes.
was, I'm not going to do that. So that much is in the book.
Yes. 100%. Part of it, I mean, for me, it was a little bit more black and white at the start. That based on the confines of the world that I had been brought into under them, I was miserable. And
Yeah.
that I spent so much time just looking back on myself and that I was stuck in my head.
Yeah.
And that was one of the beautiful things about going to grad school was all of a sudden I had black and white answers. But
Yeah.
then just the being able to do the athletic stuff that I started doing was finally a way that I would say that I finally found myself a little bit,
Yeah.
or in a way that was separate from mom and dad.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, both my sister and I have talked some about that. When I would do have some of these accomplishments, I would say, look at what I did. Isn't this
Yeah. Yeah.
amazing? And I still wouldn't get recognition on that part.
Yeah. I
But
understand
but
that.
to be able to get out of your head and in my career I do a lot of communications work and I talk about trying to find a balance between your head and your heart.
Yeah.
And for me, getting outside and being just to be at peace with myself, to
Mm.
listen to my body and have those extremes, 100% agreed that never really thought about it as being a rebellion against my
Yeah.
past, but it certainly has got some measure to that for sure.
Well, you know, you write about your parents. You say this disconnect with my parents was forever ingrained, no matter how hard I tried to do things, quote, right, my attempts weren't recognized or appreciated. If I did something wrong, it meant a more critical, mean, and evaluative future with them forever feeling judged. Um, This was a dynamic I never wanted to have or share again, yet I desperately yearned for some type of meaningful connection. And it kind of brings up another question that I have for you out of the book, because now I'm curious about you. Um, it seems to me that you were looking for experiences that were so overwhelmingly physical, combining the physical and mental, that you could kind of lose yourself in them and for a while be oblivious to where you come from and the problems you had as a child. In other words, one of the reasons I love snorkeling, it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes I'm down at a reef, in the Bahamas or somewhere, and I just hang on to a piece of rock and I stay there holding my breath. And for a blessed moment, I disappear entirely. It's just me and the little baby fish, the little baby parrotfish or whatever, eating the piece of coral in front of me. And suddenly I realize I've had this experience which has liberated me from my own body for a minute and even my own
Yeah.
consciousness. I'm just in the
Yeah.
moment. And there's not, I think a lot of people, look at sex that way too. And that's one reason it's very powerful. But, I'm not going there. I'm talking about aesthetic experiences do that for me. And I think I felt the same thing skiing sometimes, that my body's in
Hmm.
tune with the slope. I'm a good skier, even though I had polio, by the way, speaking of surviving things.
Oh, wow.
And then at a moment, literally it's just you, the slope, and the mountain. And then you wake up, and then the thought is, how am I getting from the bottom of the thing to the thing again? And then you're back in the world. But
Right.
for a second, and I wonder if you found that in your triathlon experiences, in the training, the fact that you just sort of for a minute, it's just somehow you and your body, and the
Oh,
conscious mind is less.
oh my gosh, absolutely. And that was such a big piece early on when I started running, and as you saw in the book that I was working too hard. I was trying to be focused on being the super achieving person, and then made a $5 bet to do a 5K.
Yeah,
On some of those first times running, that all of a sudden it was a total disconnect from the rest of the world,
yeah,
and being able to find those peaceful moments that was just a zen time where
yeah,
everything else, all the noise. I mean, one of the things that growing up for me, I would just say I always just hurt, and it
yeah,
was a mental overwhelming anguish. And I still think about when I swim now. I don't swim daily right now, but when I go swimming, I always kind of think about that as I get into the water, the person I am when I start swimming is different than the person I am when I get out.
yeah,
And it's not
exactly.
because I've been thinking, but it's in a similar way that when you're snorkeling, that you get into a rhythm, you let your body naturally
Yeah.
flow, and you just be, which is an incredible spot to be in.
Yeah. And the thing is, if you're smart as you get older, and I'm not smart all the time, but one of the smarter things I do is accept the fact there are things I don't want to do. Some mornings, like walk the dog when it's below zero here in Massachusetts. But I always come back grateful that I've been forced to get out of my own head and out of my own body. And that's one of the
Yeah,
reasons I like having a dog, by the way. Same thing with children. If you're a
yeah,
smart parent, you accept the fact that you're being forced to do things you wouldn't normally do, whether it's be more active with your body, whatever. And I find some of that in your book. In other words, there's a sort of a driven sense that, okay, I have cancer. By the way, everybody, the book we're talking about is Iron Dad, and the subtitle is A Cancer Survivor's Story of Discovering Strength, Life, and Love Through Fatherhood, and winning iron, training and participating in Ironman competitions. I just want to go to one quote here and just talk about this before we launch into more of the book. Again, sticking with your parents. Um, your mom is too stressed taking care of you kids, our dad said to me and my sister Laura. A few years later, when I was around 10, looking down at the notes he had written himself on his bright yellow legal pad as a script to read to us. We'll dive into this, by the way. We had been holed up in the TV room downstairs in our new house in Littleton, a suburb outside of Denver, the thin green carpet barely cushioning the tile floor. Once again, we were in the basement, out of sight and out of mind. And I'm too busy working. So you two are responsible for taking care of yourselves. That means you make your own meals, do your own laundry, get yourself to and from school. Don't beg. Don't complain to your mom. It's time for you to grow up now. No whining. And then you add a one-line paragraph here, one-line sentence. It's good. It's a standalone line. Making a child invisible cuts deep, which is the understatement of the century. But anyway, that's a powerful passage. So let's go into that from the point of view of you as a parent with a 13-year-old, me as a grandfather who's going to go pick up my 10-year-old when we're done this podcast and take her to a beach, God willing, with the
With the
chicken I just
chicken, don't
cooked for
forget your
her.
chicken.
Yeah, the chicken will be, it's cooling right now, and
Okay.
I'm going to take her. But the thing is, this is so far from the way you look at your daughter that
Yeah.
it's moving, because in a way you've saved her from yourself. You could have been someone that became that cold person, and you've chosen to do something else. So let's talk about that for a minute, irrespective of your book, human to human. How did you do that? Because you only know what you know. Your childhood was bleak, and yet your relationship with your daughter is warm. So talk about that. Talk about what changed in you, instead of that anger and sadness coming with you into your father-daughter relationship. You're not that person. So how'd you get there?
Well, I'm definitely not. I mean, I think you said a few minutes ago, we either you follow a path you know, or you rebel against the path
Yeah,
because you know it's what you don't want.
yeah,
Um, I did spend forever, and we talked about potential suicide, or just would I be disappear off the face of the earth before I met my now ex-wife, and I felt that I was starting to have a life and things were coming together. And then the moment my daughter was born, it really felt like a immediate transition evolution about, oh, this is what life is.
yeah,
That I mean, in the and I mean, the very first day she was born, um, her mom's milk hadn't come in, and it was late in the evening. We had said we weren't going to do formula. That lasted about six
yeah,
hours. But to have this little 5 pounds of kid, and that we were just synced from that moment.
mm,
Um, and just, I mean, in those 5 hours I had with this little kid,
yeah,
I had more love with somebody than I had ever had in the 40 plus years growing up.
yeah,
And all of a sudden, I mean, I've never been a drug addict by all means, but I can understand of that level of endorphin, and that, oh my gosh, oh my
yeah,
God, this is amazing, this is incredible, and I never ever want to let it go.
yeah,
Um, and 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 we always, and parents talk about their bonds with kids, but I have always just had this great connection with her. And even when we've struggled, whether it's when I was sick or as she's gotten older, that we have always found a way to love each other as part of a bigger crazy dynamic that is exponential, and really keeps me going.
yeah, yeah. And that comes through clearly in the passage in the book, Iron Dad, where you write very movingly about what you had just said in terms of becoming a parent. Um, and I'll get there in a little minute here, but we're going through in order. So let me jump in and just ask you this, and I'm going to mute this for a second while I clear throat here, clear my throat. Let me ask you how, when have you and your daughter talked? And I'm not implying that you should have or shouldn't have. I'm just curious. I mean, you're going to make people curious about your life if you write a book about surviving cancer and your love of your
Right,
daughter. So sorry,
right.
I don't mean to be personal, but hey,
Oh
it's in
no,
your
and
book.
and that's been, Frank. Just to your point, as before you ask your question, this book was started as me just trying to explain to her all that time, and then it certainly evolved into being
Exactly.
so much more. So
So
go ahead.
I want to ask you about that, how your daughter's own journey as a child, now on the cusp of young adulthood, going into the new bracket she's going to be in through as she gets older, how that close relationship and her being part of your story has affected her. And I'll just give you one personal example. The other day, I had a little biopsy done here. You can see there's something on my forehead. I'll see what it is, and it's nothing serious, and it certainly is nothing to do with your story, but it was enough to get my granddaughter, who's 10, the one that I'll be picking up, worried. And what she did with that is she went home, she lives nearby, and a few hours later, and I hadn't even talked about it, but I think her older sister said that it was a biopsy for skin cancer or something. But anyway, she showed up with a whole plate of chopped fruit that she had meticulously put together, saying, I brought you something, kind of a get well thing, which was very touching. But the worry on her face was such that I knew that should at some point I have something serious, like my wife 3 years ago, Jeannie, her grandmother had a heart attack and was very ill for a while. Now she's fine. Thank God everything worked out. But nevertheless, kids who love you and you love them suffer along with you. And it changed, the idea that the people in their life, the big person in their life who's the adult, the strong person, is
Right.
mortal is scary to a child. So I'm wondering what's not in the book. I mean, I've read the book. I like the book. I'm just saying what's not in the book in terms of just how you see her as someone who is going to inevitably be more mature than her years because she has been let in on the secret of mortality and young. And I'm wondering how that has affected the way you all relate to each other and what her response has been.
That is a great question, Frank. She got exposed to mortality really early on.
Mm.
I mean, ultimately, she got exposed to mortality before she even knew about life. I,
Yes.
I, I mean, when it comes down to it, she had barely turned 3, uh, and when I first got diagnosed, so to try and even have a conversation about Dad is sick, Dad might die, Dad might have any of that, I don't know that she had that concept.
Yeah.
There was certainly a time early on that she overheard me have a conversation where I said because I might die, and I
Yeah.
didn't think it would impact her at the time.
Yeah.
Um, but she did stand up, and she did. She was 3, and she gave me a hug, and she said later on you were joking, and I thought, well, does she really understand it? Um, what she has seen out of me, starting then throughout time, has been um, a very keen sense, and there is a part of me that does feel awful about it, that she understands that aspect of mortality.
Yeah.
Um, that she did has well, I've been much better in the last few years, but for probably 8 years after being diagnosed, I cried every day for
Yeah.
the fear of what might happen. What I do see from her now as she gets older and is becoming a young woman and figuring out that she is so proactive in not only what her actions are. Now, granted, sometimes her actions as a teenage daughter and a teenage girl are just like any normal teenage girl,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
But she does make a point of every day in every conversation, and not every conversation, but we say I love you every day and we mean it.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
and there are people who just say I love you and that's just part of it. But
Yeah.
no, that you can tell that there is a point and a thought and a I want to make it sure and apparent that you matter. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's the biggest takeaway I see from her. Every once in a while, I mean, she certainly understands as she's gotten older the sacrifices I've made for her, not
Yeah.
necessarily on a mortality standpoint, but that our life has changed, and I got divorced, but I've still chosen to stay as close to her as possible,
Yeah.
including moving a few times. And she knows that, and she
Yeah.
understands that, and
Yeah.
in our interactions continues to make a point to maintain a connection that's different than I think any other. I
Hmm.
I don't hope is different, but it feels different than other kids I see with their parents.
And I'm sure it is different too. And especially the effort you've had to make to stay in physical proximity to your daughter going through divorce. I'm just going to reintroduce you here. In conversation with Frank Schaeffer, I am Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Paul Weigel, and Paul is a father and six-time Ironman triathlete, a college professor, a lover of outdoors, and self-described professional dabbler. And I say no, he's a polymath. That's different and higher, higher pay grade than dabbler. Paul is the author of Iron Dad, a cancer survivor's story, discovering strength, life, and love through fatherhood. And we're talking about his daughter a lot and his own parents who did not care for him like he is caring for his daughter. So please subscribe right now if you're watching this on YouTube or in replay on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. It really helps us. And also to Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, so on to a quote in the book that I'm going to let just fall into the dead air here between us and ask you to tell the story of it because it's a powerful bit in the book. A little bit after noon, the phone rang and I grabbed it off the wall in the kitchen. Hey, Paul, I heard Skip say, and I'm not saying who Skip is. I'm going to let you tell the story. Skip's call confused me a bit. He wasn't one to be proactive. And now that he had a girl interested in him, he would never be one to call. Have you heard from Steph? Skip asked. She left a weird message on the phone last night. She said, I just want to say goodbye. And she isn't picking up her line when I call her place. And then, of course, you go on and explain that, but I'm going to let you explain what all that is about because it's like you're reading the book and then you come to that and, your heart goes a little cold at that exchange. And I'm wondering what that was about.
We have defining moments in our lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those pivotal moments where everything changes. That's a pivotal moment by definition. I was in college. I was a senior in college, and finally started. And we've talked a lot about kind of having this emotionally reserved family and being in a spot where I really didn't know how to express how I cared for people. And some of the times I had felt that I had been in a pretty bad burned spot. And Stephanie, it felt when I met Stephanie that we were very much in the same spot, that we both just, for different reasons, hurt just a huge, overwhelming amount. And when we had met in college, that there was a connection there because we both kind of got each other. And on what happened, I had a very bad day. I had a very bad day the day before and had ended up at my friend Skip's house and his friend Buck and had fallen asleep on their couch and got up the next morning and went home. And Skip's call, ultimately, the weird message that he had heard from Steph, her message was on an answering machine that was right next to the couch that I fell asleep on. And in her saying she just wanted to say goodbye, that she had made the decision that she had made the decision she was not going to keep living. And in just hearing that statement, I knew what she had done. And we had talked about my worry about just would my life be erased, and she had made a decision that was horrible. And I got to her apartment as fast as I could, and got to her place, and she had overdosed and had fallen asleep and was never going to wake up.
And when you say, she was cold to the touch, you say in the book.
And she would, she was 20. She didn't weigh more than 100 pounds, and she may have been 4'11", if not 5 feet. So she was this small little angel. And when I went into her apartment and was opening doors and calling out for her, when I first looked into her bedroom, I didn't even notice her because she was so petite. And then it was only as I got in more and then I saw her and was pulling off the blanket to find her, um, that it was just this, and I've still never forgiven myself,
Yeah.
um, to have missed a call, to have been trying to show love and appreciation for somebody and building a relationship, and then
Yeah.
to have missed just something as simple as a phone call, and then just be too late to solve it.
Yeah.
Um, it was obviously awful, and something I would never hope for anybody to ever
Yeah. I
have to.
mean, you finish the chapter, actually, the last words of that chapter, you write, her body was cold to the touch. And then after that, again, I can just hold it up here. It's each of these sentences is a single line. If you can see it there. Paul writes, I missed her call for help. I slept through her message. I forever felt responsible. There was nothing I could do. So in a way, what you felt there was kind of the opposite of the coldness with which your own parents had treated you. So that may have been something you experienced when you were young, before you got cancer, but obviously you were already on the road to being someone who actually has some empathy for those around you. And, in a way, that makes the rest of the book more powerful because you kind of know who you're dealing with. Because obviously it was not your fault, and yet you felt tremendous guilt. And I mentioned this before on this podcast because it's a story that really impacted me in a very different way. And that is, I remember reading an article in the New Yorker many years ago, and I have mentioned this before because it did impact me. And it was someone who had done the research of people who survived serious suicide attempts. In other words, there was no question they were trying to kill themselves either with a gun. And in one instance, someone who had jumped off, believe it or not, the Golden Gate Bridge, and one of the few people who survived, very few have. I mean, less than you can count on one or two hands at the most, over hundreds of people who killed themselves. And this person, this writer, did something very interesting. He found a number of people who had survived these very serious suicide attempts and interviewed them. They all expressed two things. One, regret when the decision was irreversible. In other words, the last thought while tumbling was, I wish I hadn't done this. So someone
Yeah.
could have reached out. But this particular story touched me and has actually changed the way I relate to those around me for the last 20 years. It really stuck with me, just as these lines of yours that you wrote. I missed her call for help. I slept through her message. I forever felt responsible. There was nothing I could do. That will stick with me. And it will bookend this thing that he said. This man interviewed him and he says, I walked from downtown San Francisco. It's about a 45-minute walk to where Golden Gate Bridge. And I said to myself, if one person makes eye contact with me and asks me how I am, I won't kill myself, because he was feeling so anonymous and invisible. And no one did. And he jumped off the bridge. And it really changed the way I relate to people. I've missed meetings that I was supposed to go to because I've been standing on one foot, really listening to someone when I say, how's your day going? And having an actual conversation. And it's become a habit with me. And it began by reading that story. I thought, God damn it, I'm never going to be that person. You will not walk by me without getting a genuine question about how you are. And I will stand and talk to you, even if something important goes by the wayside. And it's become a
Yeah.
rule of mine. And now it's a habit. And by the way, the result is wonderful because you know so many more people and you have real relationships with them. That's a different story, like, oh, what did it do for me? But it began with a very similar experience to what I feel here. I missed her call for help. I slept through her message. I forever felt responsible. There was nothing I could do. In a weird way, I know your book is about you and your daughter and love. And, the next chapter is about graduation and all that stuff. But in a funny way, those lines, along with the line you wrote before about would I be missed and what would it do to the people around me, in a weird way, I know this sounds like I'm harping on something, but in a funny way, you've written a very strong statement about suicide within this book and you didn't kill yourself even in moments of despair, and kind of this thing of responsibility for the people around you. And I really feel that's a really powerful thread in your book. I don't know whether you consciously did it or not, but it's what I take away from the book more powerfully than any other element.
Um, I I wouldn't have said it was conscious. As you talk through it, certainly, I think there are huge aspects to that.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, one of the things you mentioned about when people say how they are, I mean, we are stuck so often with we are just supposed to say we're fine, and does
Mm.
anybody really care?
Yeah.
And that we all get so robotic in this is yes, I'm fine. I have to be fine. I'm moving
Yeah.
on to the next piece. But
Yeah.
most of the time we're not. I mean, most of the
Exactly.
time we all have different issues and challenges and complexities going on that we can't explain.
Yeah.
I was doing some work a couple of days ago on a conference call, and I'd had some personal things that I was trying to deal with, and somebody just said something nice and gracious to me, and all of a sudden I teared up a little bit,
Yeah.
and it was because they had made a point to look past that just how are you? How's the weather? 100,
Yeah.
100 days of 100-degree temperatures in Phoenix and then move on. To actually see me for me was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Um, I certainly run into that now. I I try and look at people in that same way. There are certainly times I'm not as good as I wish. Uh, I certainly wish more people did that for me, still
Yeah.
to this day.
Yeah.
Um, but we all do have crazy busy lives, and we're just trying to survive what we can. I
Moment by
also am
moment.
used to one of my very closest friends, and it drives me bonkers. She does not have that capacity in
Yeah.
her to say, "How are you?" and really mean it. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just so when she does, I'm like, oh, this makes a difference. This is really big for her.
But it's
But
interesting because I think with you, the other day I had a periodontal thing done, and I met and this dentist, this periodontist, talked to me about his life and how his wife with type 2 diabetes had had trouble with childbirth, and then his own life had been saved by a surgeon friend of mine. But anyway, in our conversations, I learned enough about him to suddenly understand why he was such a kind man to me, because I was a new patient. He didn't know me. Came out of his office, saw me talking to the receptionist, took his gloves off, walked down the hall, looked at me and said, "How can I help you?" He doesn't need my business. This is a top guy in
right,
his profession. He has 2 offices. He works in 2 towns. He was here for a day. I'm absolutely nobody to him. He doesn't know me. And I thought, holy shit, I've actually met a real physician, even though it's like
sure,
this obscure periodontal thing.
right,
Well, when we talked and we went over, I said we had enough of a conversation and there were enough connections in our lives. We discovered in retrospect that I knew some people we knew and so forth. And so I did something, I'm pretty bold on this. When you get old, you can get away with all sorts of stuff. Um, you can say things to people. And I said, having heard your story of everything you've been through and all that you went through with your wife and these childbirths and so forth and so on, I said, I really understand why you are as kind as you are. I said, you are a nice man. And I knew that the minute I met you, and now I know why, because suffering does one of two things to people. Either you become hard and uncaring because you go into this shell,
yeah,
or it's like you have real compassion for people because you know what it feels like to be alone and hurt. And it's so odd because you don't expect to meet a level of real care. I know that's a strange thing in some dental office where you've never been before by the guy who runs it. The receptionist may pretend to be nice, but he's going to
right,
be all business until he gets to know you. Then you're a patient. But I wasn't a patient. I was just some guy off the street. Anyway, you say after this suicide that as seniors, we were told that the world was full of endless opportunities, but I was exhausted with nowhere to go and with no hope and no direction. I was destroyed. I felt that was so interesting in the light of, I mean, you've got this thing on the wall behind you, Iron Dad, Iron and Strong Man, this whole business. Um, you've done this amazing sport, which is the most taxing of all sports, I guess. Um, and yet, you've had these moments of not just weakness, but feeling absolutely destroyed. So let's go to some large stroke stuff. We're talking in detail about various passages in the book. Just talk about that. because you have cancer, you were well treated, and that became something that's now in the past. You have fatherhood, but then you have this other journey of, here's a guy who writes a book that says, I was destroyed, 3 words. And yet in the end, the book becomes a sort of a personal narrative of triumph over that destruction, not just over the cancer, but over the fact that you were dealt a really bad hand from your parents, exacerbated by encountering suicide when you're young. So talk a little bit about that arc, what you learned from it, and how it's influenced the writing of this book, but more importantly than that, just the way you see life, how you treat the students you teach, your place in the world. What's that journey been like?
Um, it certainly has been a fascinating one. Uh, it's interesting when you talk about relationships in the past versus moving ahead. I mean, and I think it ties into whether what I do professionally too. It's that I try and make an impact and a difference where I can every single day because it's the right thing to do. With my students, I get frustrated with them because they don't spend the same amount of time caring about the classes that I care. They don't spend the time caring about their work as much as I care about their work.
Yeah, yeah,
And that there have been some conflicts I've had because I'm like, do you not understand how much energy I'm putting in to make life good for you guys
yeah,
and
I get that.
gals? And but I mean, I do continue, and then I've done other things certainly that didn't talk about in the book of trying to make impact on things, whether it be at school with volunteer programs or
Mm,
politically of trying to do the right thing, because those are the right things to do, and because I
yeah,
really do hope to look back and say I, that everything I try and do, I try and have it be high touch.
yeah,
Um, I mean, and some of it has been time and fate. I mean, to I to be trying to do an Ironman triathlon while going through chemotherapy was not a smart thing.
yeah,
Certainly, I was trying to make a point to God and time and fate and whoever else that I was okay. Um, did in the long term it end up being somewhat I don't consider myself to be an inspirational person, um, but do some of my stories have they been inspirational to people and they've led
mm,
better, healthier, longer lives? I certainly hope so.
yeah. And I would think so. And certainly that's the story you tell in the book. There's a kind of a pivotal moment because we've been dealing with parts of your earlier life. Somewhere in the middle of the book, I've been asked many times what my first thoughts were when I learned I had cancer. Once a reporter asked me in front of an audience of hundreds of people at the King 5 studios, what did you think about when you found out? What went through your mind? How do you explain the feeling of apocalyptic overwhelm? Explosions ran through my head with so many questions. I didn't know where to begin, though I was desperate for answers. How bad? How big? Am I going to die? When? And that's the kind of hinge upon which the book turns, because obviously from then on, the story is a much higher stakes story with a few little things thrown in, like the need for hip replacement and the fact that you're doing your Ironman competitions and training while all the chemo is going on. So why don't we fast forward to some of that, just the kind of interplay between cancer survivor, chemo treatments, radiation, Ironman competitions. And we have a whole section of the book, which is kind of your blog that you were doing, about which I
Yeah.
have a basic question that I'll get to in a minute. But just talk about that. Talk about everything that was on your plate from the midpoint of the book on.
Uh, um, you summarized it pretty well, and at the time it did not seem. At the time, I knew it was overwhelming. I've always kind of looked at. I mean, I we talked about it. I had a hard life growing up,
Yeah,
and it always felt like if anybody could imagine the impossible, and I've used it as a phrase, you imagine the impossible, the incredible can come true.
yeah,
And And I mean, I literally was afraid of death.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden to be thinking, this really is not good. I mean, for 10 years, as I would have conversations with doctors and I would go through how sick I was and that I pretended I wasn't. I
Yeah.
mean, my tumor was the size of my fist. I was almost 100% blocked. I almost had emergency surgery. I had lymph nodes affected. I So I had this physical aspect that was just beyond overwhelming. And at the same time, we talked about I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I know I say I a lot. Um, at the same time, I also had a marriage that was crumbling and just falling apart uh, as I went. My wife attended one chemotherapy appointment because I begged her to. Um, but if I did not kind of take all of that and push through stronger, harder, more incredible than anybody could expect,
Mm.
then I wasn't winning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that honestly, I mean, Frank, given some of the numbers, I thought I was a coin flip. And so, uh, yeah, I made a point. And the conversations I had with doctors, I know they thought I was nuts, where I was saying, that's great. That's great that I'm this sick, but I've got an Ironman triathlon I have to do in a year.
Yeah.
Um, and One of the parts I did not put in the book because it was too hard really to go through. I had a very hard conversation with my surgeon on the operating table as he was about to put me out.
Mm.
Literally one of those, do you have any last things you want to say? And I
Yeah.
mean, I think I referred to I'm at peace with what you need to do, but I talked with him about some of the decisions I was hoping that he would make and that I was at peace with what he needed to do, but he understood the trajectory and how much impact it was going to make.
Yeah.
Um, and I've tried to, I mean, that's been something I've tried to live with the rest of my life is taking things to a new level all the time.
Yeah. And I actually, it's weird. And I have to tell people listening, I did not tell Paul in advance to give me a nice segue to a question I had, because in the middle of the book, or whatever, halfway through, you get to my cancer blog, and then the blog continues for quite some time, and you have, um, hi everyone, I had a heck of a week, and so forth and so on, and then you go through, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a writer. I've kept some diaries during the time my son was serving in Afghanistan, that kind of thing, that were very big to me to sort of remember how I was feeling. I've published little excerpts of them in some of my more memoir-like books. I earn my living as a writer, and I fold my own life into it. But I also edit in the sense that, just like you said, I didn't include this in the book because it was too hard. I'm wondering, as you were writing your blog, you were publishing it as you went,
Yeah,
and so
I
people
was.
were reacting to it. But were you editing or not writing certain things, as in this one is just too hard or too deep or too painful? I don't want to say it.
Yes.
In other words, there's a difference writing a diary for yourself that you dip into later, maybe 10 years later, and you use a piece. But even there,
Right.
you edit it a little bit because now it's for the public. And I find myself in my writing all the time about, relationships and kids and marriage, whatever it may be, even my own parents and so forth and so on. You're writing it first for yourself, but in the final analysis, you know that other people are going to read it. So there's a little bit not of, you're not pulling your punches exactly, but you're never quite telling the truth because what you actually felt at the time is never what you really want out there. I'm not saying
Right.
you twist it, but there's an inner hesitancy about going totally raw and naked into public. And I just wondered
Yeah.
how you, writer to writer here, how you wrestled with that.
I had a story to tell.
Yeah.
And that I think was part of what I was trying to do, that it was not just, here's my experience. It was a hard spot. People didn't necessarily know what I was going through or some of those experiences. There are different parts of the book that, or parts of that time that I was trying to explain because I needed certain people to either respond in certain ways or to change people's understanding or awareness. Um, we talked about, do people really know how much you are going through? And if I had not done some of that in the way I had shared it, I don't know that people would have understood my experience to the fullest extent, whether it be work or home or family. I mean, there's only so
Yeah.
much that people can know.
Well, and at the end of the book, as we wrap this up, you say this book is also about prevention. I was 43, a new father, and an Ironman triathlete when I was diagnosed with a cancerous tumor the size of a lemon in my lower abdomen. Like too many others, I avoided symptoms and difficult conversations with my doctors for several years until it was almost too late. Don't become another statistic like me. So, you kind of make, I mean, that's not the purpose of your book, but you reach out to people to try to help them. And I'm sure your blog did some of that. In other words, if I had been on your blog list and someone had said to me, you're 50 years old and you should get yourself a colonoscopy, I would have done it, or whatever the preventative method would have been. I did anyway, by the way. But
Thank you. Good.
yeah. So what, very briefly, because I don't want to end with that, but just very briefly on the way through, we will link to things for you, to your blog, to your stuff, whatever. Our producer, Ernie Gregg, will help promote the book. Obviously, we're doing that by doing this, but we'll link to the book. We'll link to whatever. Are there any cancer prevention things that you kind of direct people toward in terms of just this whole colorectal business?
Well, thank you for asking. Whether it's cancer prevention or just men's health, that has been one of the things that's evolved as this started. I mean, I certainly put in, I had symptoms and I had issues that were going on for years. And because I was a guy, I avoided talking about them.
Yeah.
And we get into issues where we don't want to talk to our doctors about things because it's awkward and uncomfortable. And especially when you start dealing with colon stuff,
Yeah.
nobody wants to talk about going there,
Yeah.
and literally and figuratively. And so I really hope that people, regardless, are going in and talking to their doctors and having regular checkups. And if
Yeah.
something's not right, that they're exploring that. I mean, all of a sudden, I could not eat foods that I used to be able to eat. And then I had blood in my stool. And each one of those individually were small, little distinct things that people, you wouldn't find that connection. But
Mm.
if I put them all together, it was a giant aha that I was always afraid to share with the doctor. And
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
that is a major carryaway for everybody, is if you know something's not right, continue to push and fight and explore until you get an answer that's realistic, or an
Yeah.
answer that is an answer versus just being brushed off. Because I jokingly say doctors just practice medicine. They're learning all the time
Yeah.
and they're doing volume. So you need to push when you need to push.
Yeah. And speak up and not be a guy and get in there and talk about it. So
Right.
take it from an Iron Man, Iron Dad. Step up and complain a little bit and tell the
That's
truth
right.
about how you're feeling, right? So I'm going to go
Absolutely.
to what you say here. You finish. You say 10 years later, as I was finally cleared from ongoing evaluations, Natalie, my 13-year-old daughter, started asking questions about my experience. It became important for me to tell her my story in a way that she could understand, and for me to reconcile my past. So that's really what the book is about, because you start out with your parents and then you have this ongoing relationship. And I think what's vivid about ending the book that way, but also just through the book, is that this is sort of an ongoing story because she's 14 now, but it's not like this
Yeah.
happened 50 years ago. So your
Yeah.
cancer diagnosis, prognosis, treatment journey takes place over a period of time, but that period of time is still ongoing because Natalie's in the story and the whole thing keeps going forward.
That is true. And I think that's the beautiful part of the story, is that, yes, I mean, the cancer and the Ironman and doing all those races
Yeah.
is part of who I am, but it doesn't fully define me, and I've got a heck
No,
of a
not at
future
all.
ahead.
Yeah.
And it's so cool to be able to now be in a position where I can say, this is a future that has got endless opportunities and
Mm.
that can explore and try new and different things every day. The story is not done, and I don't know what the future looks like, but that's what makes it cool.
Well, what's so nice about that story, your story and mine as a grandfather now, is that increasingly as a father and then as a grandparent, your story is not being written by you anymore because the love you have for this child is actually opening another story up that has nothing to do with you. You're there for her. Just like you said at the beginning of
Yes,
the story, if you had killed yourself or you had died, the hole that you leave, it's not just all about you, and I feel this about suffering in general, people who, are terminally ill and want to kill themselves sooner. You know, I I've argued against that with people because I'm saying, basically you're saying that I know this sounds brutal, but your comfort is more important than the gap you leave in the relationship you have with the
right,
people who are counting on you. I mean, what are you
right.
thinking of? I mean, surely that's a definition of altruism. You stick around for the people you love, even when it's inconvenient to yourself. Maybe that's the lesson of your book.
And that's a very that is 100%. I would say that every day, that could be easy. It is easier to opt out
Yeah,
because it's easy.
yeah.
But it's the burden and what people would have to deal with that they would have to carry forward, and that's not fair to anyone.
Yeah, exactly right. So anyway, here's the book. Once again, Paul Weigel, Iron Dad, a cancer survivor story, discovering strength, life, and love through fatherhood. That's what the title is. But what the book is really about is loving life enough to stick around for other people and fight
Yes.
your fight because they depend on you. That's how I read it.
Thank you. Then Frank, I so much appreciate our conversation today, and your thoughtfulness in reading and asking questions that really delve into things I hadn't thought about it at that level. And it's very powerful for me. So
Well,
thank
I
you.
appreciate it. And listen, all the best to you. Stay in touch with us so we know how you're getting on. Tell us how your daughter is once in a while.
I
And I'll
will.
leave you to don't sign off when I do because Ernie will still be around to get details about what we can link to. So I'm
Okay.
going to say goodbye now, but Ernie Gregg will hold the fort and take that stuff down. So
Terrific.
take care.
Thank you, Frank. You too. Nice speaking with you. Enjoy your time with your granddaughter.
I'm on my way. I've got to put my flip flops on, put that chicken in a plastic bag, and I'm out the door. So take
All
care.
right. You too.
Okay, bye.
Thanks.